All right, next. I get the opportunity to interview the Senate President, Rob Wagner. Rob represents Senate District 19, which includes Lake Oswego, West Lynn, Tualatin, Southwest Portland, River Grove, and Durham. He has served as the chair of the Senate Education Committee and the Senate Democratic leader before being elected as Senate President earlier this year. Also joining us will be House Speaker Dan Rayfield, who represents the Oregon House District 16, encompanies Oregon State University, you know I have to get this in, go Beavs, and Corvallis, where he lives with his wife Amanda and son Adam. He currently serves as Speaker of the Oregon House of Representatives. Rob and Dan, come on up.
Morning, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Okay, so we're going to take a clustered approach to questioning, all right? So it means you have to remember all three of these and then figure out how you want to answer them, in which way, and maybe how you want to correct the other person.
Well, when he gets it wrong, I'll just pick it up from there.
That's simple,
So
right? That's what we'll do.
It's the House and the Senate.
Okay,
So,
right, that House-Senate thing, right? Big brother, little brother, is that?
Interestingly, I ran for the Senate in 2010. It was one of the best things that ever happened to me because I lost that race.
Yeah.
And so I was able to come right into the Oregon House where the real work is done.
Where things actually happen.
Yeah.
Right, more people, and it's more difficult, right? There's more coordination, there's just more, like, a lot more going on there.
You know, we have a lot more energy. There's more spirit. There's more ideas. And, you know, we lead the state.
you can tell he's actually a short timer. So
Right.
if people haven't, you can Google him and find out. He can.
It's funny what happens when you're not up for re-election, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden,
Yeah.
That's
it's
exactly
true.
right.
He's trying to make the case to other people in the
Right.
other 35 counties in the state.
Yeah.
So.
But then it goes and gets stuck over here with the Senate president, and then you just never know what's going to happen, right? I mean, it's like things get bogged down, they get slowed down. Like, is that how it works?
Yes. I mean, unquestionably
You want a
so.
spade to dig your own hole here? You still have to work with me. In
We still got
February
one more session.
Yeah, this is great.
All right, no, seriously. So here's what I want us to get after here. Let's get, and for a lot of people in the room, and Dan, I know that you are, you're serving your last term, and Rob's, essentially going to be around for a while. He hopes. We'll see. It depends on how this goes.
Yeah.
Next 15 minutes might determine
Let's
that.
see what my wife
So
says
let's
about
maybe share with the audience a little bit more about your background. I gave a quick brief overview of kind of where you come from, but also let's also capture. It's been an interesting couple of years, right? There's been a lot of change in Salem. There's been a lot of change in leadership. There's been a lot of new momentum. I think we felt momentum today with a lot of things that have happened over the last year from a state standpoint. So maybe capture a little bit about yourselves, a little bit about 23, and kind of what you're excited about as we think big about 24. So whoever wants to start.
Yeah, happy to. I think both of us are homegrown Oregonians, had experiences as young people growing up, coming to high school, going to college. I was an overeducated kid from the suburbs and then actually faced a pretty significant medical issue. I ended up dropping out of college on the East Coast. I came back to Portland State University, go Vikings. Here, there we go. A few of us
go
left out
Vikings in the
there.
house.
My son's at Oregon State, so we
Go
have,
Beavers.
We have words, and it was let knowledge serve the city. It's how I found my passion into public service was through that work, and I ended up getting internships and getting a chance to work down in Salem. And then spent 20 years in and around the building, and now I'm almost an empty nester, sending kids off to college and kind of playing that full circle. And it has been a fascinating opportunity to serve in the legislature the last few years. It has been, the pace of it has been incredible, but we've also been able to, I think, really come together around some really big issues. And you heard Senator Wyden talk about how it really is the Oregon way. Well, if you look at this last legislative session, there were almost 3,000 bills that were introduced. 650 of them ended up passing. About 94% of them actually did have bipartisan support. So I think some of the media and some of the heated moments that you see sometimes aren't necessarily reflected in the policies that we see. And I know, part of what we did as having a new team coming in with a new speaker, new Senate president, new governor, new leadership really all over the building, was trying to structure wins early in the legislative session. You've heard about the CHIPS and Science Act, and I'll turn over to Dan to kind of talk about some of your thoughts on the big wins from 23. But following what Senator Wyden and President Biden did in passing that landmark legislation, the fact that we set up a joint committee around semiconductors and right out of the box ended up doing what ultimately became the biggest cash on the barrelhead and tax package on a per capita basis in the country to be able to leverage the innovation that we see across this state. We're talking about thousands of great jobs, both in the construction industry and for the long term. So that's just one example of when you saw big bipartisan support early in session on that. But don't want to take all the oxygen.
Oh, you already did.
Yeah. Well, since he didn't win his Senate seat, I want you to say more about that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like I didn't come into this like you as a traditional politician.
Yeah.
I was also like you. I was a dropout of college. I failed out of college. I didn't graduate high school on time. I got fired from jobs. It was a very different period of my life. I struggled with addiction, struggled with ADHD. It was a big part of my life growing up, and it eventually wound my way into the legislature. And part of those experiences really give me a different lens as I walk through the Capitol, as I view legislation. But I would also say that my parents, which was a unique and non-traditional background as well. My dad was a Republican. He was a colonel in the Air Force Reserves and a senior vice president of a commercial insurance company. And then you had my mother, who was about as progressive as it gets. This is someone who would drag me to protest the Iran-Contra scandal in the 80s, if folks remember that, and it was horrible. I hated being dragged to that as a child. And she would also go to the Nevada nuclear test sites and get arrested protesting nuclear weapons. And as a kid, it was very interesting, and because this is how it shaded how I really look and operate in the legislature and some of the packages that we did in 2023. Because as a kid, you would sit there and talk with your mom, and she would say, well, I really want to get rid of nuclear weapons to keep the world safe. My dad, a Republican, someone who I also deeply love, would say, we need nuclear weapons to keep our world safe. They both wanted the same thing. They were going about it in different ways. And so as we walked into the 2023 legislative session, you have to think we're coming off of elections, right? Democrats are saying, Republicans, you don't care about education. Which is not really the truth. Republicans are saying, Democrats, you don't care about education, again, which is not on the truth. The people who get elected to serve have these same common values. What we did differently in this last session is we put Republicans and Democrats at the tables as equals to find solutions to some of the biggest problems that we had in the state. So semiconductors, Democrats and Republicans, equals at the table trying to figure this thing out. We had unity in the issues facing our state when it comes to behavioral health and housing and homelessness. We brought Democrats and Republicans together to create one of the largest investments in terms of dollars and in policy to combat the housing and homelessness problems that we have in our space. We did this in rural infrastructure, so we have development in all four corners of the state. We did this in water, which actually will draw down federal dollars and create investments in one of the most significant parts of our economy, our agricultural industry. So a very unique way that we went about the session.
Well, I think, so as you look ahead and you think about, you talked a lot about bipartisan partnership. We're obviously at the Leadership Summit, which I believe you told me you were at the first one.
I'm pretty sure. I was talking to Duncan about this. I just had come back from grad school in DC, started a job working with the American Federation of Teachers, and I remember, if I wasn't the first one, it was many of them.
Number two, maybe.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah,
I think I was in middle school.
Yeah, but he's adorable.
So but as you've seen it and you've been a part of the Oregon structure for a long time, how do you see the partnership with business? And as you come into running and be in very significant positions in the state, and the partnership with business, and like, where do you see that? Where do you see the challenges with that? Where do you see the opportunities with that?
Well, I'll just say, part of the innovation around the business plan and this summit and people coming together is thinking more long-term about how do we solve problems together across the state. Because, I'm a little bit of a nerd. Last night I went back on and was looking on the website back to the original business plan 21 years ago and thinking about the conversations around people and productivity, going through the recession of the early 2000s, the challenges that we faced in 09 and 11, looking at the pandemic and trying to keep those principles going forward to think about a long-range plan that embeds accountability back into some of our systems as well. And there's one issue that I was talking to Duncan about on this, and something I'd really like to see as a potential signature initiative heading into the 25 session. Back in the late 1980s, there was something called the Oregon Progress Board. I don't remember if people remember Shines or Shines 2, and really there were governors at the time that really adopted this, leaned into it. Legislators actually would have some of the goals up on the wall, and it looked at, instead of the silos that we have, I think sometimes in government, it's a state agency here, it's their key performance measures. You talk about current service level and roll up, but what are we doing to look at a 2050 vision? How are we leveraging best practices around that, finding cross-sector metrics to be able to, whether or not that's in certain education areas or whether or not that's in public health, how are we setting that long-term vision? And so I think leaning into things like the business plan and using that as a structure, revisiting some of those conversations and some of those best practices that we had. And I will say, going back and revisiting, I remember the 2011 summit when they said, build the bridge. And I just want to give a little bit of a, can we get one of these? Yeah. The fact that we actually got a commitment coming out of this legislative session to put Oregon's share on the table to be able to leverage the investment that you're seeing in Washington and the federal government to get the I-5 bridge started, and we're going to get it completed.
Yeah. And I think what I would say is the one thing that I absolutely love about our legislature is that we are a smaller state. We are a smaller legislator, and if you want to have collaboration with your legislator, you can email them, and you can go out to coffee with them. And I think the diversity of experiences and backgrounds in the legislature is amazing. And to be able to have that access where a lot of the ideas that you see that get passed don't necessarily come from legislators themselves. It's through partnership in communities. The semiconductor idea, right? If you think about this, was built out of a task force that was done in public-private partnership. It's that type of relationships in a state like this where you can have more immediate access. We can be more nimble to be responsive to the issues that we're seeing in our communities. In the 24 session, right, part of what we were going to talk about moving forward, again, you're going to have a housing and homelessness package. Are those all legislative ideas? No, that's in partnership with the community. We put together a joint task or a joint committee to really focus on substance abuse, ballot measure 110 and the crisis that are facing our communities. That is work that's being done in partnership with the community. Again, the accessibility of the legislature as facilitators for the good ideas in the state is something that I absolutely love and I would encourage. And the one thing that I think for people to remember is the legislative body is a transitory body. Right? People come, they go, very often, in fact, whether it's 2, 4, or 6 years. And so the institutional knowledge for our state resides in our communities, and continuing to build relationships as people come into the legislature and exit the legislature.
Thank you. So our last topic here, and earlier today we had a live poll voting where we had asked the audience to tell us what they thought would be the most important issues of the 10 items that we had up on the screen. And number one going away was K through 12 education. And education's been a theme throughout the day. And we know it's critical to the economy. We know it's critical to the advancement of our state. We know it's critical at all levels. What do you see as necessary to improve our performance specifically? How do you think about that and connect that across the entire education consortium?
You want to go?
Well, yeah, go. You do K-12. I really want to touch on higher ed because that wasn't one of the questions that we saw, and I was talking to folks backstage about that too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities in K through 12 in terms of a workforce standpoint and where the workforce is going to be 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And that's going to take a lot of leadership among the thought partners within our educational system as well as within the legislature as we start to think about how to marry those things up to make sure that our kids are ready for what is invariably going to be a very different economy 20, 30 years years down the road. We have funding issues with our education system K through 12. We need to make sure as the legislature, as we're looking at the right number for our districts, that we're all operating from the same information. Because every 2 years we get into this question is what is that right level of funding? This year, we had educators and folks come into the legislature and say, this is the number we needed. We funded that number, but now we're still having questions about whether that was the right number. And so we need to make sure that we're operating on the same information moving forward. And then the one thing is I have a 12-year-old in school, actually just got his grades back. It was the first time I've got grades back for a child, so much better than mine as a kid, I'll just say that. But we really, as parents, right, we want to make sure that we're getting what we're paying for, right? There has to be outcomes driving in that space. So I think the governor's leaving some really good conversations moving forward, and I'm excited to see where those end up.
You take it to higher ed.
Yeah, and I graduated high school the year, I'm older than Dan, both in spirit and in body. The year Measure 5 passed, and lived through, both my sisters are teachers, my mom, my aunt, all educators, lived through what I would say is the disastrous decade of what happened to education in the 90s. With the passage of Measure 5, then 47, ballot Measure 11, prison construction, everything that happened in the 90s in Oregon, the bottom dropped out in terms of local funding for schools. Everyone probably remembers, we had no rainy day fund, we had no ed stability fund. So when we hit the recession of the early 2000s, right about the time that the business plan was coming together, these were the challenges that we were facing. Hillsborough, I saw the mayor of Hillsborough over here, and he was an educator too, knocked off 17 days off the end of their school year. They cut all of their CTE programs. And it's been a process over the last decade, 20 years to be able to build that back. Measure 98, the Student Success Act, the things that we're seeing reinvestment. My pitch on higher education is since that time and even before, we need to think about what is the aspiration that we can have together to be able to build a post-secondary future that ties back to job development, job creation. And I think there's a word that has been missing a little bit, and that is equity. When we look at our students and who's coming up through our systems of post-secondary education now, I was part of something called the Joint Task Force on Underrepresented Students in Higher Education. And are the students still here from Oregon State and U of L? Can I get a woo? All right, there we go. So if you have been engaged in the conversations with students who are working so hard, what you paid on a per credit basis to be able to go to post-secondary is not what they're paying. And the challenges that they face, kids that have really struggled through COVID, we owe it to these students, and it's important. It's the backbone of our economy to be able to have a 21st century vision for post-secondary education and workforce training. That really gets me out of bed every single morning, and that's what I like to see, and partnering with the voices of these students for the future of the state of Oregon.
Well, I think that's an excellent way to end what was a short conversation. I could spend another hour with both of you. So thank you, Senate President Rob Wagner.
You have to stay
Speaker of the House, Dan Rayfield. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you.